So my name's Brian. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master in Exchange Server. Used to teach the Certified Master program over in Redmond when Microsoft ran it a number of years ago. I'm an Office 365 MVP, and I'm director of a gold partner that I run here in the UK. We have offices in Cape Town and Hong Kong as well, called MB Consult. I'm here today to do two sessions with you. Later this afternoon, we're going to look at compliance and data security, if you want. This morning session, we're going to look at user security or identity. Okay. The aim of our 2 days is to look at Teams and everything around it. A number of years ago, I used to teach a program for Microsoft called Exchange Environmental Dependencies. And Exchange Environmental Dependencies, I can't remember the acronym. Anyway, lost that. The idea of Exchange Environmental Dependencies was a 5-day in-depth course that we ran at Microsoft, and it was everything about Exchange, but not Exchange. We did a day on DNS, for example. We did a day on IP routing, okay? Some of the interesting stuff that we used to do. We did a day on MIS, or what it was called back then, and a whole bunch of that are still valid today, but I haven't got you for 5 days, and I haven't got you for Teams environmental dependencies. But that's some of the idea of what we're going to cover in this session. Okay? We're going to look at what is not Teams, but what I need to get right to make Teams work. Okay? And we're going to start with an identity piece. So we're going to be looking at things like security, how I log on, how I secure my logon sessions, how I can access and restrict access to Teams. Now, actually, I could do that for Exchange Online, SharePoint, Skype, etc. It doesn't really matter. Teams is just an application as far as this piece is concerned. But what we roll out here, what we look at here, we can do for Teams just like we could do for anything else. Okay? We're going to have a look at, and we're going to do a lot of whiteboarding, is the idea of this one rather than slides. And we're going to take your suggestions, your feedback, say, well, we do it this way, or we're interested in that. How would that work here? And so that's part of the plan of the way we'll look at it. Okay. I've got myself an order. Where's it gone? There we go. And so my general idea is to have a look at users, licenses, how we do some admin. Don't worry about the small print, that's in my notes. How we log on, so authentication. Some of the security options that are available to us and how they work. MFA will always come up because that's very important. Okay? And we'll finish off with some options on passwords, or at least the getting rid of passwords, so passwordless sign-in. Okay? And then all that will tie back to how we can fit that into Teams. Okay. If you want to contact me, that's my details. I'll leave them on the screen for a little bit longer, and then I'll remove them as I do some more whiteboarding. First thing up we're going to talk about is users. Okay. So one thing that I find very common, I go and speak to a customer, and they've got Office 365, and I'll talk about Azure Active Directory. And they're like, no, we don't have that. Okay. And there's a great disconnect between understanding what you've actually got in the cloud. I've got this. Well, actually, that means you've got this, and this. Okay. And so Azure Active Directory is my directory in the cloud. Okay. Just like AD, Active Directory, is my directory on-premise. Okay. And we can do LDAP directories and other directories as well and make all that work. But for the majority, the very large majority of people, it'll be AD on-premises. It'll be Azure AD in the cloud. There are companies that are cloud only. NB Consult is cloud only. We don't have an AD on-premises. The company only existed 6 or 7 years ago. We decided to be a cloud company, okay, and run everything off the cloud. But the majority of my customers, they've got some legacy. It's great calling AD legacy, isn't it? They've got an AD environment. I've got customers with 15 AD environments, all separate. How do we make that work? Okay. And so there's some of the things we're going to mention. Okay. So, as a sort of show of hands, how many people, that was probably mentioned earlier, but I wasn't looking at that point, but how many people have not yet started a cloud migration? So they really don't have Office 365 and Azure AD. Nobody. Everybody's got something. Okay. How many of you have chosen to, oh, actually, there's a question. How many of you don't have AD? Right, everyone's got AD, fine. Okay. So, couple of things about AD that's worth setting as a baseline. You probably well know this, but if I have Active Directory and I have my cloud tenancy, Azure Active Directory, okay, from a licensing perspective, especially if you're enterprise licensing, Microsoft Enterprise licensing, okay, you can have one Azure Active Directory tenant. All your licenses go into that one tenant. Okay. You're not supposed to. You get special dispensation to have multiple tenants. But you should avoid multiple tenants because the collaboration stuff isn't great. Okay. There's a whole bunch of merger and acquisition scenarios that are then problematic because you have two tenants. You've got your tenant and the company that has acquired you or the company you're acquiring and their tenant. And how do you make all that work? But the general aim, the general idea would be single tenant, okay, in the cloud, single Azure Active Directory tenant. On-premise, that could be one or many separate Active Directory forests. Okay? So how many people have more than one Active Directory forest in their organization? 10 or 15%, 20% maybe. Okay. That works. We can do that. Okay? That's not a problem with regards to what we're looking at. But what we have available to us is the ability within Active Directory, let's take that one out and do some drawings, is we can create, and let's do a cloud. Okay, so there's my cloud, and there's my Azure Active Directory. Okay. Up in Azure Active Directory, I have my user. Okay. I've got my Active Directory, let's do blue. Active Directory is all triangles. Okay. I have my user in Azure Active Directory. Let's call my user Mary. Okay, so I've got a user called Mary. She's created Azure Active Directory. Sorry, she's created an Active Directory. Okay, and I've got my Azure Active Directory tenant. I spin up my Azure Active Directory tenant. That's my admin, let's say. I'm going to call it admin. It's the first user I create. I'm going to say on Microsoft. I can't spell. All right. I create my first user account when I create my tenant. I choose my company name. They suggest a tenancy name for me. That's my name I give at tenantname.onmicrosoft.com. Okay? That's a cloud account. Okay? It exists only in the cloud. Okay? You will have one of those, okay? Because you get one when you first create your tenant. Okay? There's a very good use for those. Okay? There's a good use for limiting those as well. Okay? There are scenarios where maybe you do all of it as cloud accounts, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay? Once I've got that in place, though, I've got the ability to synchronize my Active Directory to my Azure Active Directory. Okay? DirSync, to give it an older term. Or Azure Active Directory Connect is the tool that we'd use nowadays to do that. There are third-party tools that do the same thing as well, but Azure Active Directory Connect is what we'll find, especially for consultants, will go out or we'll put into place for people. Okay? So Azure Active Directory Connect is a box that I run, a Windows service that I run somewhere, and Azure Active Directory Connect connects into my Active Directory, reads the data out of my Active Directory, so it needs an account that has read permissions, puts it into its own database. It's called the metaverse, and there's connector spaces and a whole bunch of terminology there that we might mention a bit. Okay. Connects to the cloud, so we tell it the tenancy details. So in this case, we'd tell it admin at on Microsoft, etc. Okay. And it reads data in from the cloud and puts all this into the Azure Active Directory Connect database. And it works out the relationships between cloud users and on-premise users, or objects in the cloud and objects on-premise. Okay. If this is a brand new, just started environment, okay, and I ran, let's say, Express mode when I configured Azure Active Directory Connect, it will make for me the account that does all the reading, and it gives it sort of fairly global, fairly general write permissions as well. Okay. It will create for me a very limited account up in the cloud. So although I will type in the admin account when I set it up, it will create a limited account for me that I can't delete. And it will use that account to read and write in and out of the cloud. Okay, so it's not running as global admin or anything like that, although I do need global admin to set it up. Okay. And then it will take the information that it receives, it finds in one, and if it's Express mode, it's the whole of the directory. And it will write that information up to the cloud. So what we'd end up with in this scenario is we'd end up with Mary, let's assume M up there, we'd end up with a user object called Mary up in Azure Active Directory as well. As I make changes to Mary on-premise, So let's say we've given her a name, my mum, let's call her Mary Reid. Okay. So I change her display name on-premise. Okay. The connectors within Azure Active Directory Connect will see that and will write that change later. Okay. Who knows how often? Not 15? Not 3 hours? 30 minutes. Yeah, there you go. All right. Okay. You can change the schedule. You can stop the schedule. Okay. You can run it manually. So you can do it every 30 seconds. Microsoft might throttle your activity there if you do. But absolutely, is this working? Make a change, run it manually. Oh, yeah, it's working. Let's go back to the half an hour. Okay. Or I've just sacked. Nobody here from Deutsche Bank? No, okay. I've just sacked 18,000 employees. Quick, run it now. Yeah, that sort of scenario. Okay, and anybody related to anybody is not meant to be a joke, of course. But as an example, okay, there are times when I might need to run it quicker than the half an hour schedule. Okay. So I make a change, half an hour's gone by, and so of course her display name is updated in the cloud. I'm just shortcutting it for simplicity. Okay. Try this. Let's go into the cloud and change her display name. Okay. So for a bit of colour. Let's say I want to change it to a maiden name, or whatever, T. And of course my mother's maiden name is one of my super secret pieces of information that I'm never going to tell you, because all my password, no they're not, all my password resets are based off my mother's maiden name. If only they weren't. Okay. If I try and change a synced user attribute that comes from on-premise in the cloud, it won't let me. It's read-only. Okay. There's a single master, and with Azure Active Directory Connect in place, that master is Active Directory. If the attribute exists on-premise, then I can't change it in the cloud. That makes my admin interesting, and when we talk about licenses in a moment, we'll see why that can become very interesting. Okay. But while I've got a synced account, okay, I have to do my admin on-premise, which might not be a big issue. I've been doing my admin on-premise for however long. You know, in comes the cloud, and I don't really have to change a lot of the user provisioning and deletion. You know, a new hire, I could just create them in AD like I created them before. There's a few more things to consider, but it's not a massively different scenario. And this is what most medium and larger companies will be doing. In the smaller business space, okay, or in the environment where there's no Active Directory on-premise, okay, then we'll create the users straight away in the cloud. Okay. So if I create a cloud user, okay, so like my admin on Microsoft user account, okay, I can create other accounts up in the cloud. Okay. Now, before I do a lot of this, one of the first things I'll probably do is register my domain up there. Okay, and my demos are Contoso. So, for example, I could create, I could add contoso.com into my tenant, and then I could create a user account. Let's have a user here, call them Bill. Bill at contoso.com. Okay. I could create that user account directly up there. Okay. There's no Bill in AD. Okay. That user is fully read-write in the cloud. Okay. Now, if I start mixing my identities like this, that's where my admin becomes difficult. It's like, I need to change Mary's details. I have to do that on-premise. I need to change Bill's details. Oh, he's a cloud person. I've got to change him in the cloud. Okay. So there's a tendency that you'll go for one or the other. Okay. Small businesses tend to go for cloud. Larger businesses, because they've got AD and they've got management and that's what they're used to, tend to put the sync in place. And of course, sync needs a server and other things like that as well. So there tends to be a cost of implementation. It's free software, but there tends to be a cost of implementation to consider as well. Where this, as I say, becomes interesting, though, is let's say I have a bill down here as well. And if I have a bill down here, and I go and manually create a bill up in the cloud, well, who am I logging in as? I log into Windows, I'll probably log in with Bill on-premise. But I open up Exchange Online, I'm logging in with Bill in the cloud. Okay. I try and sync Bill, and it fails, because there's already an object up there that matches. Okay. There is a bit of tech running called hard and soft match, which allows it to try and, well, that bill equals that bill, therefore they must be the same. I'll overwrite and try and merge some of the settings. Okay. But it can be problematic if you have multiple, let's say, user types. So on-prem synced or cloud only. Okay. And for my last one, it's not really relevant for teams. Okay. Of course, I could create users in AD and not sync them. I could have objects, user accounts, groups, and so on that don't appear in the cloud. Okay. But if they don't appear in the cloud, I can't give resources to them. So for example, if I have a security group on-prem, and I choose not to sync the security group OU, well then I can't permission stuff in the cloud to members of that security group. Okay. If I have a user on-prem and I put them in an OU, and I choose not to sync that OU, that user doesn't exist in the cloud. Indeed, if I took the OU that Mary was in and decided not to sync that OU, Mary disappears from the cloud. Okay. If a user account is in scope for sync and then later is in scope not to be synced, the account is deleted in the cloud. There's 30 days and I can get it back, but it's gone. There's no access, I can't log in, there's no data that I can get access to, and so on. Okay. And so you have things like leaver scenarios. What do I do when someone leaves the company? Do I put them into a leavers OU? Do I sync the leavers OU? Well, what happens if I do that? What's the implications of that? And that matters for teams as well. You know, where's all those one-to-one chats they've done gone? Where's the compliance? And we'll look at that later today, and how that matters. Okay. So from a user perspective, okay, we have to have the user in the cloud so they can log in. Therefore, we have to have them in the cloud so they can have teams, etc. Okay. If they're on-prem and we sync them, they're read-only in the cloud for the majority of their attributes. They're certainly read-only in the cloud for everything that you can set on-premise. Okay. And if you have duplicates, watch out for clashes and so on. Okay. A little bit more technical that's going on with this. Let's do this in black. Okay. Something that's worth being aware of with regards to my identities is what's called Immutable ID. How do I know, for example, Mary on-prem is Mary in the cloud? What happens if I change her name? Is she still Mary on-prem in the cloud? How does that work? You know, people can get married, people can get divorced, people can change their name. Well, if I change your display name, if I change your common name, that gets synced up to the cloud. It's going to keep working. And it's done with a concept called Immutable ID. There's a value on my cloud user called the Immutable ID. I'll just draw it a black line. I'll call it X. Okay. There's a value on my object on-premise. And I'm also going to call it a black line an X, although just for argument's sake, that will do for now. Okay. And it's this value that ties the two users together. Okay. I don't change this value on-premise. And when I try and sync Mary up, it's like, well, I'm actually syncing X to X. Okay. If there is no X in the cloud, if there's no object immutable ID of X, it will make an object for me. Okay. If the immutable ID X disappears on-premise, it will delete the matching object in the cloud for me. Okay. A number of years ago, immutable ID on-premise, or the source object for immutable ID on-premise, was the object GUID. The object GUID is an attribute that gets set on every user account that you create in AD. Okay. It's a base 64, it's a GUID, sorry, not base 64, it's a GUID value, and it's read-only. Okay. It gets created when the object is made, and I cannot change it. Okay. That's fine if you're a single forest environment. Actually, single domain environment, even multi-domain is problematic for this. Okay. I sync the user up, okay, and up in the cloud, there's an attribute in Azure Active Directory called Immutable ID. Immutable ID is a string. Okay. It's base 64. But if you take the base 64 string and convert it to a GUID, you'll see that it matches. Okay. They look different, but they're actually the same value. Okay. So here, where I've called it X, well, just for confusing, it might be Y here, that's the GUID Y, but it becomes base 64X. It's actually the same value. So I'm just going to call it X for simplicity. Okay. There's a problem there, though. The problem is, if I have multiple forests or multiple domains on-premise, and I use things like binary tree or quest, and I want to do user migrations. Okay. If I take Mary, let's say that's the merge and acquisition scenario, for example, that's the old forest. I've got reasons why I think the old forest is badly designed, badly implemented, has issues. I've seen all those as comments to a forest migration. Or it's a mergers and acquisition scenario, and we need to move them into a new forest. If I do that, the migration tools will copy all the attributes across, but they can't copy object GUID. Object GUID is read-only. Okay? So I use my migration tool, ADMT and upwards, there's a whole bunch of them, okay? And I create a user here called Mary, okay? But her object GUID now, let's say, is Y. Let's say I choose to sync this user account up to the cloud. We'll provision a second Mary. Okay? If I log in as this second Mary, all my Teams are gone, my voice is not working, my mailbox is missing, everything doesn't work. Okay. So a couple of years ago, Microsoft changed the way Azure Active Directory Connect worked. And you can move to this model if your Azure Active Directory Connect is quite old. They have a thing called MSDS Consistency GUID. It takes a lot longer to write than it does to say. Okay. It's an on-premise attribute. It's been around since about 2008, AD schema, I think. Okay. And there's nothing in it. It's empty. Okay. This is now able to be used by Azure Active Directory Connect as your source attribute for your anchor. Okay. So it's called your source anchor, in effect, on-premise. Okay. So rather than using object GUID, it can use MSDS consistency GUID. Okay. And what it'll do is it'll copy your object GUID value into your MSDS consistency GUID for you. Azure AD Connect will do that. Okay. So if I turn on this, let's call that MSDS. MSDS equals X. So where my object GUID was X, my MSDS consistency GUID is also X, or actually it's not a GUID, it's a string, so it looks different. It's actually the same value. If you did a conversion in PowerShell or something like that, you'd see it's the same value. Okay. So yeah, open up the AD tools and it looks different, but it's actually not. Okay. Now I come and do my quest, binary tree, etc., ADMT or whatever migration. Okay. I get a new object GUID of Y, but my MSDS value is X. I copy that across. So in my mergers and acquisition scenario, I copy across the attribute that ties me to the object in the cloud. Okay. I come back to my sync engine, and I update my sync engine to read and write from my new forest. I have to be careful not to read and write Mary at the same time that I'm reading and writing this one. I can only have the source user once. There's a few things, tweaks I can do to make it work more than once. But generally speaking, Mary exists here. She logs in over here. It gets to some weekend. It's our cutover weekend. We move Mary across. She comes in on the Monday, and now she logs in to the new environment. Okay. And in that weekend, and there are ways around this, but generally speaking, I will stop Mary syncing in the first forest. That means she will disappear in the cloud, because I've removed her from the scope of sync on-premise. And then half an hour later, and this is where I might do it more frequently, but I do a sync. Half an hour later, I take Mary and I move her into an OU that is syncing in the new forest. But because she has an MSDS consistency GUID value that matches a deleted object in the cloud, it undeletes the object in the cloud, and then this Mary now equals that Mary. User comes in on Monday, nothing has changed, because we've copied all the attributes. We've copied all the groups she belongs to, we've copied all the security, etc. Okay. So from a Teams perspective, I could do an AD migration over a weekend with no data impact to the user. Very achievable, okay, but takes some architecture and some knowledge on how it works. And so there's one thing we need to be aware of when we're looking at what we're doing on-premise. Be comfortable with the idea that AD is my master, source of authority. I write stuff in AD. It's read-only in the cloud. But it's not based on my username or my display name or anything like that. It's based on my object GUID. If you're a single domain in a single forest, that's fine. But if you're in a scenario where it's multi-domain, multi-forest, you should move to MSDS consistency GUID and then consider that when you're migrating your objects across. And so at the end of all this, be it, again, single domain, single forest, or multi-domain, many forests, many environments, okay, I'll have the user account once or a few times on-premise. It'll result in a single user up in the cloud. And then I can look at things like, how do I allow the user in the cloud to do what I want that user to do? Okay. That's usually licensing. Okay. It certainly starts with licensing. Okay. There's no concept in AD of licensing. There's no attribute in AD that says, here's the CAL that you have, if you remember your client access licenses and stuff like that, back in when everything was on-prem only. Okay. CALs were very much a trust. I've got 100 users, I buy 100 licenses. Okay. But I could have 200 users and have 100 licenses. There was very few things that were barriers to that idea. It was trust-based. In the cloud subscription model, if I have 100 users, I have 100 licenses. If I have 101 users, one user doesn't get a license, one user can't use the service. So I buy another license. Okay. But I don't go and buy 200 licenses unless I am made of money. Okay. So there's no concept of license on-premise. So there's an example of an attribute that exists in Azure AD that I might need to set, or I will need to set. Okay. And so from a licensing perspective, if I want to give a user the right to use Teams, I need to give them a Teams license. If I want to give the user the right to have an Exchange Online mailbox, I need to give them an Exchange Online license. If I need them to have OneDrive or SharePoint, I need to give them a SharePoint license. There isn't a separate OneDrive license. Okay. And I can buy individual licenses, or I can buy packages of licenses, the SKU. Okay. I've got a demo later, and the demo is based on the Microsoft 365 E5 license. Okay. Now, I could do a 2-hour session on licensing as well, but I'll bore you all. Okay. But when I do my demos, I tend to put them in the most license, just because it means I don't lose any features. But features are going to be important. We need to know what packages we need to buy to get the certain features that we're going to get. So as we talk through some of the stuff in this session, we'll mention the license that's important as well. Okay? But at the moment, none of this is license specific. I don't need a specific license to do any of this. Obviously, there was some on-prem tools for migrating that's out of scope for the conversation. I need to buy those. But for the cloud stuff, when I get a tenant, I get an Azure AD tenant, and I can do this. I can create these objects. There's no limitations on me. Somewhere in the 50,000 or more license objects I'm limited to, but generally speaking, there's no license limitation. But I take my user, and I can give them a license. I give them a license that provisions the service for them. So I give them a SharePoint license. It goes and creates their OneDrive location. I give them a Teams license. It lets them log into Teams. I give them an Exchange Online license, and everything goes wobbly because it's really strange with Exchange. Okay. Those other two licenses, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, although there's a SharePoint on-prem, we can ignore that. Okay. There isn't a Teams on-prem. There's no attributes in AD that Teams makes use of. Teams is cloud only, and you'll be well aware of that. So if I come and want to do any Teams-specific admin, okay, it's all read-write in the cloud, because all those attributes that Teams makes use of, okay, they're all not read-only. They're not restricted because they don't exist on-prem. Okay, unless they're general AD attributes. So I want to have your, here's a good example. Teams shows me as BR, Brian Reid. Okay? But if my on-prem AD says Reid B as my display name, who's got back-to-front display names in AD? About 10, 15% of you, yeah, okay. The cloud will take the first letter of the first word in your display name and the first letter of the second word, or maybe sometimes the last word, it's not consistent, in your display name to make your initials. Okay? So I've got customers, they're in the sort of the Reid Brian type scenario, and so the icon is RB, but not BR. Okay? So I think, okay, well, I need to change that. That doesn't look right. I can't change your display name in the cloud because your display name is an AD attribute, therefore it's read-only in the cloud. So although you might see this surfaced in Teams, you need to be aware that the attribute is read-only in the cloud because it's a core AD attribute. But other things that to do with Teams, So for example, we turn on audio conferencing or stuff like that. What telephone number are we going to give you for audio conferencing? That's a cloud setting. That belongs in the cloud. We don't have an AD equivalent, and therefore it's not read-only in AD. So I give my user the license, and then I can do these things for the user. I can give a user individual licenses, or I can give them a package of licenses as a SKU. So for example, I could have an Office 365 E3 license, probably the most common one. Okay? Or I could have a Microsoft 365 E3 license, which is basically the Office E3 license, the EMS E3 license, and the Windows E3 license. Okay? So it's packages of packages, which is why licensing's a very long and interesting conversation. And I'll have them with my customers, and we're finished talking, and they're like, can you do that again, please? Okay. How does that work? And what do I get with that? Okay. But once I've given the user the license that I've purchased, I can then make use of those services. Okay. So the stuff I'm going to talk about today, mainly this afternoon session on compliance, okay, I'm going to need the E3, for some of it, the E5 license. Okay. So some of it won't work in the small business or the scenarios, which the E1 licenses or the small business, the Microsoft Business licenses, because they don't come with the compliance feature set. Okay. Some of the stuff we'll talk about now with regards to security, specifically MFA and conditional access. Conditional access to give me MFA requires Azure Active Directory Premium licenses, but I don't get an Azure Active Directory Premium license by default. I just get an Azure Active Directory Basic license by default. But generally speaking, a lot we're going to talk about today, this first session anyway, just works for us. Okay. I talked about Exchange in that scenario. Exchange ties itself very well into AD. Let's have, what color have we not? I'll use red again. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of attributes that Exchange writes to my user account in AD. So I've got Exchange on-prem, loads and loads of attributes get written. Links very similar as well. Actually, there's not so many attributes, but a bunch of them. Okay. Azure Active Directory Connect copies my attributes up to the cloud. Okay. So the cloud knows that I have an on-prem mailbox because the attributes that exist, things like where my database is and the server it's located on and other stuff like that. Mainly it's an attribute called the Exchange GUID. But there's these attributes copied to the cloud. The cloud therefore knows I have an Exchange Online mailbox. So if I license a user for Exchange Online, sorry, I have Exchange on-premise mailbox. If I license a user for Exchange Online, they won't get an Exchange Online mailbox because Sync says they've got an Exchange mailbox on-premise. Okay. But that concept doesn't exist for Teams because there isn't a Teams server solution, for example. Okay. So I can give a person a Teams license. They can do Teams. I give them an Exchange Online license, but they might not get a mailbox. But that allows me to migrate their mailbox, and then they do get a mailbox. Some of our compliance stuff this afternoon, that will become important in. Okay, so I mentioned it here. Okay. With our duplicate user, remember we created Bill in 2 places. If I create Bill in 2 places, so I'm not syncing Bill in AD, I've gone and created a Bill up in the cloud, okay, and I give them an Exchange Online license, they'll get a mailbox. Because there's nothing saying they have an Exchange mailbox on-prem, because they're not an on-prem user. Okay. Now I create Bill on-prem and give them a mailbox on-prem. Now I try and move their mailbox. That doesn't work. So there's a good awareness, especially for Exchange, of where my attributes are, what they say, and what that means. But for Teams, again, no Teams server, so that's never an issue with giving someone something for Teams. Okay. It matters a bit for Link. Okay. But when you move to Skype for Business in the cloud, Skype server, Skype for Business in the cloud, and then move to Teams, and there's other sessions that will talk about that. Okay. So that takes me to a piece where we've just done a review of where all my users could be. We've looked a little bit about licensing and how important it is to have a license, and that's a cloud attribute that I need to set. Okay. I also, if I have Azure Active Directory, actually, no, I get it now with an E3 license. If I've got an Office license, I can do this. Okay. I can do group-based licensing. Okay. So I can create a group on-prem, let's call it G, circle it there, it's my group on-prem. That gets synced up to the cloud. Okay. and then I can assign a license to the group. Now I add people to the group on-prem. Again, an on-prem group is read-write on-prem. It's read-only in the cloud. But I could take Bill and add them to the group. I could take Mary and add them to the group. When that change of group syncs, they'll get a license assigned to them. So I can do license administration relatively easily. There's a whole bunch of caveats like what happens if I belong to two groups, one which gives SharePoint Plan 1 and one which gives SharePoint Plan 2. That doesn't work. But if you have a more simple solution for your licensing, it's a great way of managing licensing, certainly things like a baseline license. I've got a number of customers who are like, E3 today has, let's say, E3 in February had 15 things in it. E3 today has 17 things in it. What are we going to do given the service desk has never heard of half of them? How do we support these cloud solutions? Okay. And so a number of my customers will do a baseline. They'll get a group, they'll put the people into the group, they'll give some components of the license. So for example, let's pick on Sway, because I haven't picked on that yet today. They decide that, well, we're not going to support Sway, so we're not going to license it for people. Okay. We don't yet do Teams, so let's not license Teams. Okay. Now Microsoft know this happens, okay, and so their general tendency is they release a new product, they turn it on. Okay. They don't tend to, well they used to 5 or 6 years ago, release stuff turned off. The problem they found was no one used it. So you're a developer, you've worked for 2 weeks writing this new cloud app, okay, and I know examples of where people have joined Microsoft and within a week have had stuff live in the cloud. So they don't spend a long time developing. Yes, they do spend a long time developing, but some of the stuff they develop very quickly. And the default license is not to show, so you've done all this hard work, and your feature's not used by anybody. Okay? So the way Microsoft work at the moment is, it gets turned on. So when Teams was released a number of years ago, Teams was available. It's only more recently that Teams was tied to a license, and I could take the license off people to stop them using it. Okay. So at the point where we are at the moment, if I don't have a Teams license, I can't use Teams. But if I do have a Teams license, therefore I can. But there was a scenario in the past where I didn't need a Teams license and I could use it. So you can do very much the impact of shadow IT. So there could be people in your organization who've been using Teams, and now you come along and go, right, we've been on that 2-day course. Let's think about how we're going to do this well. We haven't got any compliance rules. We haven't got this. We haven't got that. Let's stop the Teams deployment for a bit and unlicense everybody. And suddenly people are like, oh, hang on. Critical business stuff's gone wrong. We've been using it for 2 years or whatever. Okay. And so you need to be very careful with what you take away from here, with what you learn new from here, because people, your users, may well have been using it for a while, and vice versa. It's a great tendency of IT departments to be very controlling. Modern work space, modern work environments, the idea is to be less controlling, but still to be secure. And so that's what we need to look at, rather than just going, we don't like that, let's stop it. Okay? Let's not do Sway because the IT department don't understand it. Well, let's do Sway, here's a Google search. Okay? I'll help you if it really doesn't work, but if you're just asking me questions, there's another place to go, where we have services we'll offer and services we won't support. That doesn't really work when you get to Teams, though, because it's such a pervasive, all-encompassing application that you can't really say, well, we're not going to do Teams because, or whatever. Okay. So we've got our users. We've synced our users to the cloud. We've given them licenses. Okay. User needs to log in. How is the user going to access all these services that they've got, that we've given them? Okay. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is a little bit of authentication history, and then we're going to talk about what's available to us today. Okay. So I've got the ability, I've got a user in the cloud, I've got the ability to log in as that user in the cloud. Okay. Of course, I've had the ability to log in as the user on-prem from whenever I built my AD environment and joined my workstations to it. I can log into my AD on-prem. Okay. And sync matters for this. How do I actually log in as that user in the cloud? Okay. So if we go back 11 or so years when Office 365 first turned up, and I say that to people and they're like, really? That long ago? Time flies, doesn't it? We go back to when Office 365 first came out. There was 2 options for authenticating in the cloud. Okay? I could have a cloud user, and I could give them their own password. No. What was that about notifications not popping up in the middle of presentations? Lost it. Where's it gone? That one. There we go. I do have Do Not Disturb on, so it would be quite nice to not to happen. Okay. Yes. So when the cloud first came out, I could have an account in the cloud, and I would have a password. That's right, PWD up there. I'd have a password for that account in the cloud. Okay? Or I could implement Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS. And on-prem, I'd build an ADFS box, and I'd allow the user to log in via ADFS. Okay. Now, ADFS becomes key infrastructure. If that's unavailable, I can't log into the cloud. So, well, I might go and make a couple of ADFS boxes and then stick them behind a load balancer and then go, okay, well, I need to log in when on-prem. That's fine. So my on-prem workstations can reach ADFS, but my mobile devices that are out in the big bad internet, they can't reach ADFS. So I need an ADFS proxy. So I have a WAP server, Web Application Proxy, which is my ADFS proxy. And, well, I need a load balancer for that. And I need a few of those in case it fails. And maybe I need some of those in another site in case I have site failure. And it's getting silly, okay? Especially as a lot of the first moves to the cloud, well, let's get rid of this complex beast called Exchange Online, which I might have had 1 or 2 boxes and lots of disks. And the consultant comes up and, fine, let's get rid of Exchange. But you can't really do that, but that's another conversation. And let's implement all this so we can do your login. And so companies have these boxes sitting there. They really don't know what they do until the certificate expires every year, and then they panic. Okay? But that's the other way of doing authentication. Okay? And so the way that would work is I have my user on my device. There's my keyboard. Let's make sure I can see the cloud in this. Okay? And this predates Teams as well. But I connect up to my cloud service. Let's call it Exchange Online for simplicity. Okay? And Exchange Online was doing old basic or legacy authentication methods. Okay? So I would pass my password up to Exchange Online. Exchange Online would take my password and pass it to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory would go, contoso.com, that's ADFS. So Azure Active Directory would pass the password down, no, that's wrong. Would pass the password down to ADFS via WAP because it's out on the big bad internet. WAP would pass the password request into ADFS, and ADFS would pass it into AD, and AD would go, yes, that password's correct. All this over SSL, okay, but it's still passing the password around. Okay. The alternative to all this was a thing called password hash sync. I could take the DIR-sync of the time, the AD Connect of the time, and I could sync my password up to the cloud, and I'd have Azure Active Directory do it. Okay, so the same process works. I'd hit Exchange Online. It would go, I don't know who you are. You're anonymous. It would go to Azure Active Directory and pass the password to Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory would go yes or no, because Azure Active Directory had a copy of your password, and it would let you in. Or with ADFS, a few more steps, we're logged in, and Azure Active Directory passes back a token to Azure AD. Azure AD passes back a token to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online says yes. And all this is our legacy auth. All I need is a username and password. Roll forward a number of years, and Microsoft introduced modern authentication. It's OAuth. It was invented by Twitter and a couple of other organizations. Microsoft call it modern auth. It's the same thing. Okay. If I have ADFS, I could implement OAuth. Okay, I turn it on in the cloud. Microsoft decided to turn it on for new tenants from August 2017 and onward, but not turn it on for old tenants. In the last couple of months, they've decided to turn it on for old tenants. Okay. So you could well be in a mix of having modern auth enabled for some services like Teams, because it's only ever Modern Auth, and not be Modern Auth for other services like Exchange Online and SharePoint and Skype. SharePoint was always Modern Auth. Browser-based stuff was always Modern Auth. And the way Modern Auth worked was I would connect up to my service. My service would, I don't know who you are, please go to Azure AD. So notice the difference in the way authentication flows work. The first one was I pass my password in clear text over an SSL session, but it's still in clear text, to the service, and the service would log me on for me. But with Modern Auth, I hit the service goes, I don't know who you are. It would send back a redirect. This is a browser-based technology. It would send back a redirect. I'd be redirected to Azure AD. Now, if I've got my password stored up in the cloud is doing my authentication for me, I'm now authenticated. If I'm still using ADFS, I would now be redirected. This diagram is going to get very messy. I would get redirected to ADFS. ADFS goes to AD. AD says yes. Back to AD, past the token that I've been given that says, yes, you can log in. ADFS says you're good. I pass that back up to Azure AD, which understands the token and says, Azure AD says good because ADFS says good. I pass that back down. I pass that up to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online says, yay, you're in. Here's your mailbox. Okay? And if you do that in a browser, you can see it all happening in the address bar. Okay? Or you open up Fiddler or things like that, and you can watch it happening. It's a great way of learning what's going on in these scenarios. But it's still a whole bunch of servers and complexity, all for the idea that I don't want to keep, or I don't want to tell the cloud my password. When in fact, that's what I did in the first place anyway, with legacy auth. I told the cloud my password via a different route anyway. So over the last couple of years, some new technologies have become available to us. Okay? We do them via Azure Active Directory Connect, so we use the Azure Active Directory Connect service and box to turn them on. Okay? The first one is still password hash sync. Okay? So it takes my password from AD. It generates a unique salt for it to uniquely encrypt it. It encrypts it 1,000 times with the same key, and then sends the 1,000-time password hash sync, which is really what it should be called, rather than just password hash sync. It should be password hash sync encrypted 1,000 times with a unique salt up to the cloud. And the cloud has this unique blob of data that they can't reverse. When I connect to the cloud to authenticate in a password hash sync scenario, I will pass my password, again in clear text, but over an SSL channel. Microsoft will take the clear text password that they see. They will hash it 1,000 times, and they'll compare the two hashes and go, yes, you must have typed in that password correctly in the first place, because if you didn't type in the password correctly in the first place, it wouldn't have generated the same hash. Therefore, you couldn't have, you must have got the password right. An advantage to that, a very subtle advantage to that, is Microsoft see all the bad password attempts we make. Okay? They also see all the bad password attempts the hackers make as well. So they have a very good idea of what passwords are not good to be using today, like summer 2019 exclamation mark with a capital S. And we all know that's secure because our IT department have told us you need complex passwords for the last 15 years. Okay? And a complex password needs to have upper, lower, number, and a symbol, or 3 of those. And so the user goes, summer 2019 exclamation mark. Yes, I've done what the IT department say. Okay? Or indeed, the IT department go, Tuesday 2019 exclamation mark. Hello, welcome to the company. Here's your new password. Who does that? Who has very complex and good long passwords for their users when they start? Nobody does. Because all they're going to do is answer support calls all the time when the user's forgotten their password. Right. We've got the ability with Azure Active Directory, if you've got the P1 license now, to download a list from Microsoft of Microsoft's well-known passwords. You can't read it. They don't let you actually read it. But they can download it, and you can place it on your domain controllers, and you can stop users having Control-Alt-Delete, set my password on-prem, to a common password in the cloud. That's an Azure AD feature. And it's nothing to do with Teams, but if I can secure my users' identities on-prem, that benefits me for the use of cloud services like Teams. So that's password hash sync, many times encrypted and synced to the cloud. The alternative option that I've got, I can still do ADFS, but without the complexity. The alternative option I've got, let's go bright yellow, is in my Azure Active Directory Connect, I can make let's make that a nice thick line. I can have a connection up to Azure AD, and I keep that connection open. It's a TCP connection over 443. I keep it open. My firewalls don't like that. They close it, so I open it again. But the idea is I keep that connection open. And then when the user authenticates to the cloud, so in comes the user's connection to the cloud. So this is yellow as well. The connection comes into the cloud. The cloud passes it down the open connection. No inbound firewall rules required. No need to talk to the security team. Hello, security team. I'd like you. No. You're not going to listen? No. You want to open a port? We don't do that here at this company. Okay? And so we don't need to do that. We don't need to talk to the firewall team, or indeed, who's ever, apologies if you're the firewall team, who's ever phoned the firewall team and said, can I have this, please? And 3 weeks later, they come back with something different. Okay? And no, that's not what I asked for. Okay? That's very common. Okay? I don't need it in this scenario. As long as I've got 443 outbound, and everybody gives everybody 443 outbound, don't they? Unfortunately, but there you go. 443 outbound to the cloud. When I try and authenticate to the cloud sends my authentication request down the open connection. Azure Active Directory Connect sends it to AD. AD says yes, and we pass it back. The cloud hasn't done my authentication. I don't need to sync my password to the cloud if I don't want to. I've got a couple of government clients, and government paperwork from 5 years ago said you can't do password hash sync solutions. Government paperwork from this year says they can. Maybe it was last year now. But from 5 years ago, absolutely no, you can't do that. And so I got government clients that are all ADFS because they weren't syncing their password. Well, this option here allows me to not sync the password hash sync as well, but to have it come back in. And for fault tolerance, I just stick a connector on another server and open that up as well. And I can have maybe 3 or 4 servers running this very lightweight agent connecting to the cloud, and it will just load balance across them. And so I can do my authentication to AD, but get given the tokens that say, Azure AD says, so Azure AD gets authenticated, Azure AD then issues a token for the service I want. So in the case of Teams, I hit Azure AD passes it through to on-prem. On-prem says, great. Azure AD issues me, it's called a refresh token. A refresh token has a lifespan of 90 days by default. Okay? And as long as I keep refreshing it within 14 days, it stays active. Okay? And then for the service I want access to, Teams, in this case, I get given an access token. So I have my refresh token, I have my access token. My access token lasts 1 hour, but my access token is unique for Teams. If I want to open up OneDrive for business, for example, well, I've got my refresh token, because let's say I opened up Teams, I got a refresh token, I got an access token for Teams. Now I want to open up OneDrive for business. I go back to Azure AD and say, here's my refresh token, and it goes, fine, here's an access token for OneDrive. So I've got my same refresh token, and I've got 2 access tokens, one for Teams, one for OneDrive. Okay. And that process keeps going. Those access tokens last for an hour. But important there, once I got this refresh token, I don't come back to AD to check the user anymore. Okay. In theory, I don't come back to AD for another 90 days, because that refresh token is valid for 90 days. Okay. Now, if I disable the account on-prem, and I sync that disable up to the cloud, that will revoke my refresh token. So within the hour, because sometime within the hour I'll go back once the access token expires, and I'll go and get another access token. At that point, my access token has expired, it's an hour old. I come back with my refresh token and say, can I have an access token for Teams, please? Here's my valid refresh token. And Azure AD goes, oh, no, it's not. Your account has expired. Sorry, not expired. Your account has been disabled. Your refresh token is no longer valid. Okay. If I change my password on-prem, same behavior. I change my password on-prem, that makes my refresh token invalid. Okay. But otherwise, that refresh token is valid for 90 days, and it keeps getting renewed. Okay. If we look at that scenario in a little bit more detail, I got my refresh token. Now I actually do the authentication. Once Azure Active Directory once Azure Active Directory knows that I've entered the right username and the right password, okay, I can implement rules for authentication. I can do conditional access. you can have access on certain conditions if you want. I need the license for it. Conditional access, though, allows me to do things like, well, you can log in if you provide me your username and your password, and you answer your phone when it rings, multi-factor authentication. Or, so I left them over here so I can get them from my bag. Or you can have access if you enter the code that's on your mobile phone. Or there's a company called Token2, and they do hardware tokens for Azure Active Directory. That one's quite, I like holding it like that because you can't see it. But I hold it like that and press that, and I get a 30-second code. So I give the user the hardware token. Who's got organizations where there's limitations to the use of phones within parts of the organization? PCI compliance and things like that. Server rooms and stuff. There's about 5% of you maybe. So you've got options like these things and key rings. Coming soon, I don't know how soon, but I suspect next week. Find my keys. YubiKey. I can plug that into the USB key slot, press the button, and I'm logged in. That's me. You can't be me, even if you know my password, if you don't have this. Or you can't be me if you haven't provided the code. And I've given you a code on here, or given you a code on your phone, or whatever. So actually, I could have a password 123. It might say, no, you can't have that, it's too common. Oh, okay, then I'll pick something slightly more complicated. Summer 2020. See what I did there? Exclamation mark. And my number. So I can have conditions of access if I pass the rules. And a common one is I answer the phone, or I have the device, the hardware token, that I need to have available. We talked earlier about having, briefly, we had Active Directory, and I joined my workstation to Active Directory. Well, if I sync my computer account, not just my users and my groups, but if I sync my computer account up to Azure Active Directory, the computer can be tied to Azure Active Directory as well, just like the user is tied to Azure Active Directory. Much more complex what's going on. The computer gets a self-signed certificate, it syncs the certificate to the cloud, and then the computer knows it's in the cloud because the certificate is also in the cloud. But it's basically certificate auth for devices without managing the certificate. I've had a number of companies over the 15 years that I've been doing consultancy. Before that I was doing training, but in the 15 or so years, 20 years, I've been doing consultancy. I've had a number of companies go, we'll do certificate auth, and the projects just go on and on and on. It's very complicated to do. But with Windows 10, and actually I'm going to backdate that to 7 and 8.1, not 8, I can do certificate auth without managing any certificates, and it's called hybrid AD join, hybrid Azure AD join. With conditional access, I can do things like, yes, you can log in, but only on a company machine. So I've got a scenario where I can say, yes, you can go and work from Starbucks or the local library or work from home, but you have to work on the device we've given you, or you can work on your device, but only if we register it and control it with certain settings. You have to work on the device we've given you, because if you try and log in not from the device we've given you, it will tell you can't log on from here. Okay? Now that, to come back and complete my circle, that happens at login. That happens when my access token is issued. And remember, my access token is issued once an hour for a service. Okay? If I'm connected to Teams and Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive and a couple of on-premise apps via App Proxy and other things, they've all got access tokens. So let's take a very simple example. Let's say I was connected to 6 different apps in the cloud. Okay? The chances are that one of those access tokens will expire in the next 10 minutes, just by a law of averages. Therefore, if I take my laptop and walk out of the building and I've got a geo bound on it, I've got, you can log in if you're on this network. Okay? I take the laptop and I go across the road to Starbucks and I join their wireless network. Well, those 10 minutes might have gone by. One of my applications' access tokens expired. I go back with my refresh token, and it goes, no, you need MFA to do this, or you need to be on a company device, or you can only do it if you're on that IP range. Okay? And so although my refresh token expires every hour, sorry, my access token expires every hour. Therefore, I go and look at my refresh token and things like conditional access kick in. Because it's an access token per application, the chances are that it will kick in much quicker than I might think than just the hour. Okay? So it's very easy to test, and you get to claim the expenses back from your company. You can go down to Starbucks or pick your favorite coffee shop and say, I'm doing IT testing. I need to buy coffee. Okay? And you go and test, oh, look, I'm locked out. I can't use the service because I'm using my personal device. I can't use the service because I'm on my home computer. Or I can use the service the company's given me. I can use Teams from a hotel in a foreign country because I'm working on business, because I'm on the company device. Okay? And conditional access allows me to do all those scenarios. From the risk perspective, let's just slide across to the right again. We need the Azure AD P2 license. Microsoft have a very unique insight into the state of the internet because they're such a large, effectively, ISP. They can see connections from where bad, malicious attacks are coming from. They can see network sessions that are trying lots of different usernames and maybe the same password, or lots of different, the same user and lots of different passwords. So the first of those scenarios is more common. And Microsoft will give risk to certain network sessions. For example, if they see malware coming from an IP address, they'll mark the IP address as more suspicious. And if they start seeing you logging in from or trying to log in from that IP address, they might do things like block that IP address. But meanwhile, you're in Starbucks, still on the company expense buying coffee, and you're allowed in. Now, when we had an AD lockout, you were locked out. But with the cloud, you could be locked out because you're on a malicious network or someone trying to be you. They don't even get to log in. Even if they get the password right, they're told it's wrong. Okay? But you're logging in from the same device repeatedly. Microsoft go, oh, that device is more trustworthy. Okay? You roll up things like Microsoft 365 E5, and you turn on Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, and you can do things like, oh, the machine's picked up some malware. Windows Advanced Threat Protection has detected the malware. It's made your device risk high, and now you can't even use that device to access your data until you remediate the issue on it, at which point Windows Defender notices it's been remediated, or indeed remediates it automatically, because it's got that functionality. The issue is removed, and your device goes back to low or no risk, and now you're back in to your data. You pick up a virus, you can't get to your company data from that machine. They're all functions that are available to us. And Teams is impacted by those, because Teams is just a piece of data, or it's just an endpoint that I'm trying to connect to. I've got customers who will do the risk license. They'll buy the P2 license for people like executives, IT department, HR, and finance. Or I've got other customers who will do the P2 license for those they've given a mobile phone to, company phones, Intune license, you do the risk. But for people who are limited by a geo-block, you can only work when you're in the office, because in fact, when they finish at 5 o'clock in the evening and they go home, they have no interest in doing work for the company. They've finished, and they don't start again until 9 o'clock the next morning. They've no interest, I don't understand this, but they've no interest in working from home. Okay? They don't need things like the risk license, because we might just lock them to the IP range of the company. Okay? So there's a number of different things we can build out with conditional access to help us to protect our resources. Okay. We talked earlier about, we talked about it with Exchange Online. This is not valid for Teams. It's worth mentioning. The legacy auth scenario. I did basic auth and not modern auth. Basic auth, legacy auth, doesn't support MFA. So if a hacker, and I'm going to say from China, because that's where all the hacking attempts that go against my account seem to come from, at the moment anyway, and companies recently I've seen Nigeria. So apologies for either of those countries, but that's where I tend to see hacking attempts from at the moment. I've got a hacking attempt going on. It's coming in from those locations. They tend to use legacy auth. They tend to connect over legacy endpoints because they know legacy isn't going to be impacted by MFA. So they'll do things like they'll try and connect to smtp.office365.com, the SMTP endpoint of Exchange Online. They don't try and connect to Teams Because Teams, if you've got MFA on, who's not got MFA on? Look, nobody says. Yeah, everyone's like, oh, yeah, I've got it on. Hey. Who's got MFA on for everybody? About half of you. Who's got MFA on for admin only? Or at least admin? Hey. So some of you here definitely, because by the way of the hands, haven't even got MFA on for admin. Hey. Not to one extent, not that matters. The hackers know that you might have and you will be turning on MFA for at least admins and then other users. So they'll hit endpoints like smtp.office365.com because there's no MFA on the legacy endpoints. So what we can do with conditional access is we can block legacy authentication. We can go into the services like Exchange online and we can say if you try and do a legacy endpoint, you're blocked. Now we know there might be a couple of applications within the organization that need to connect to that legacy endpoint. You know, the one I commonly see is help desk ticketing systems. You know, they'll do things like pop an IMAP to a shared mailbox. You know, and so great, okay, the ticketing system sits here. It's on a specific IP address. So I'll do a conditional access rule for that user account from this IP only. That's allowed to do legacy auth. But if you try and do legacy auth on that account or any other account from anywhere else, I'm going to block you. Okay. Now, there's a bit more work to doing that, but we can go into Azure Active Directory, we can look at the reports for login, and we can see the sorts of logins that people are doing and the sort of sessions that they've gone. We can see if it's a legacy authentication session as well. Okay. But for the non-Teams things that I want you to take away from here today, okay, you need to be looking at MFA for everybody. But don't think that means I'm going to pop up at every login going, please answer your phone. Implement it well, and you'll get MFA at risk, or MFA MFA when I'm outside the business, but not inside the business. That's a really simple one to implement. Okay? Or one I've seen recently that's quite good is MFA if your device identifier is invalid. So for example, you can say in conditional access, if the device, I might do it in reverse, I might do something like block all connectivity if the device is not Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, and ActiveSync. So if someone tries to hack the device string, send an invalid device string, because if I do it the other way around, if I say things like MFA required if Windows, Android, iOS, etc. Okay. If I come with an iOS device, a legitimate iOS device, I'll get an MFA prompt. But if I come with a hacking tool and say something else, null device string, for example, the rules say MFA if Windows, iOS, etc. What you should have is things like block if not Windows, iOS, etc. So when they come with a null device string or an invalid device string, they get a block. Okay? And there's probably no devices in your organization that don't fall into that category. Now, obviously, if you're a large Linux environment or other third-party services that connect, an IoT type environment, for example, there's going to be a bunch of user accounts that are going to be, but you know what those accounts are, and you limit those accounts to maybe a geographical space or a certificate or whatever. But for the majority of your users, they're on Windows, they're on iOS, they're on Android. So we block if it's not. Okay. But be very careful. Include within your conditional access rules things like block if not, for example, Windows, iOS, except if the user is. And always have an exception user. Okay. Don't build conditional access rules without one or two exception users. And Google break glass accounts with Azure AD for more on that. Okay. The idea is that if you get the rules wrong, you lock everybody out. Okay. And it takes about 2 minutes for this to implement. So you don't get a lot of time to realize you've got it wrong, because by the time you've got it wrong and you're locked out of Azure AD portal, the whole company's locked out of Azure AD. Okay. Back in, was it October? Microsoft data center in San Antonio got hit by 3 independent storms in 3 different directions and took out the data center. Okay. It became common knowledge at that point, people realized that Microsoft's MFA system was in that data center. when they bought it and they built it and they put it in one data center, whoops, people couldn't log into Office 365, etc., Azure AD because they had MFA turned on. Good. Well, they couldn't log in because they weren't getting the text messages because the text messaging system had gone offline. So I had a number of customers phone me up, what do we do? Well, that's where your break glass account comes in. You might store the password in a safe somewhere. You might have a number of people who authorize the use of that account. You open up the safe, get the credentials out, log in, turn off MFA, disable a couple of conditional access rules. And then my customer will be like, well, what about China? It's like, well, the chances of the people who are hacking you actually getting in this window that MFA is offline, in 24 hours, it's probably back online again. The issue's resolved. You turn conditional access rules back on. The chance of the hacker getting in that time frame, whereas you've got no productivity because no one can log in, which do you want? And so you should have the ability to do that. So the ability to turn off MFA in an emergency so that people can still use Teams and make phone calls, etc., before they get kicked out. Okay. No, my glasses aren't there. Where did I put them? There. Okay. Have I covered everything I wanted to cover? A couple more things. We can do passwordless sign-in in Office 365 now. It's actually been enabled in Microsoft accounts, so what used to be known as passwords, Microsoft Passport and Live ID, if you can remember that back that far. We can do passwordless sign-in in Office 365 now. You turn it on with a PowerShell command, and you need the Microsoft Authenticator app. That works as long as you've got Mod North turned on, so that would work for Teams. So the user types in their username, and a number appears on the screen. On their phone, 3 numbers appear. All you have to do is pick the same number. So on the screen, I might see, let's say, 76. On the phone, I might see 10, 20, and 76. Just for the simplicity of, so I go, okay, 76. In that case, the number 76 was in the 3rd position, but it could have been in the 1st or 2nd position on the screen. Then I use my fingerprint, so I click approve and use my fingerprint on my face if it's iOS, and I'm in. I don't type in my password at all. Recommendations for password security now is have a unique password that you don't use anywhere else to secure your access. And to do things like don't force it to reset, because if you force it to reset, your refresh token gets expired. The user has to change their password. They have to type in a new one. And what will a user do if you make them change their password? They'll add 1 to the end. If I know what your password was last time, I probably know what it is now. There's a whole bunch of hacking tools out there that will work them out for me relatively easily. It's not hard to brute force passwords nowadays, especially lots of users know what passwords are commonly used. Sorry, lots of hackers know what passwords are commonly used, and they'll just try the common stuff. And so it becomes very important to look at, from an IT security perspective, to look at things like passwordless or token-based or things like the YubiKey and others that Microsoft have said they're announcing soon. There's rumors there's a big announcement on the 10th. That's later this week, isn't it? Yes. That's why I suspect that will get announced then, but I'm not certain. We need to keep ahead of the malicious actors. We need to keep ahead of the hackers. So what I thought I'd do to finish off is go through some of those things we've talked about and show you how they would work and how we can set them up. So he says, there we go. Find the right window. I've got too many windows open. Okay. Is there any particular demo that anybody would like to see? He says, putting himself on the spot. Is there anything of some of the stuff we've talked about that you think, oh, that's new? I'd like to see how you do that.
The disabling of model, the demo on that, not disabling of non-model for Exchange.
So turning off modern auth. Sorry, turning on modern auth.
Turning on modern auth, but not allowing legacy.
Not allowing legacy. Okay, so turning on modern auth is easy. It's a PowerShell command. Okay. My demo tenant was created this morning, so it's got it enabled. If my demo tenant was more than a couple of years old, it would have been disabled. Okay. But from a conditional access scenario, yeah, I'll show you. I'll add that in. I'll make sure I show that. Okay. Anyone else? Sir?
Enabling guest access for teams based on the condition can effectively bypass or domain your devices and allow those guests to be able to join.
Okay. So the scenario there is I've got a condition that says X, Y, and Z. You know, there's my condition. That applies to my users. I'm a guest, and I try and join the team, and it goes, no, you're not using a Contoso device. Well, they don't work for Contoso. They'd never have a Contoso device. Is that? Yeah, okay. All right. Let's have a quick look then at some of this stuff, some of the stuff we've talked about. So Azure Active Directory portal, okay. Licenses. Okay. This particular tenancy has 4 products. Let's go and see what I've got in here. So for example, I've got 0365 E3. Okay. None assigned, 25 available. So I pick my license. I can go into, in the scenario we had earlier, license groups. Okay. There are no groups with licenses assigned. And click Assign. Pick the group. And I don't know any groups in this tenant, but let's wait for that refresh to finish. And has it got, have I actually got any groups? Oh yeah, there we go, SG Retail, for example. Let's say I decide that I'm going to give to all my retail staff, who are all in this group, an Office 365 E3 license. Okay. And I can pick more than one group. I pick license options, and here we go. Let's turn everything on. Today, I think it's 17 things in here. Kazala for Office 365 got added recently, and what was the other one that got added recently? To Do appeared as a new license in the last couple of months. Okay. So if I went into this in February, there'd have been 15 things in here. If I go into it and I set a few things on and off, let's say I go back to it today, having set it up in, let's say, February, the new ones default to on. So if you set up group licensing, you have to be aware that as Microsoft add new functions, they'll turn them on for you, which is usually the opposite of what you want. But let's say you were going to roll this out, and you go, okay, well, Staff Hub's been depreciated, so let's not even start looking at that. And let's say we're not going to support Sway, like the example I gave earlier. So you go down the list and go, okay, here's what we're going to support. Here's what our baseline license is going to be. It doesn't have to be every license on the list. So I pick the items that I want, and I go assign. Now, there might be some conflicts there, so it might generate some errors. Okay? But it will now schedule. It will look through the membership of that group. There may be nobody in it, so just from a demo purpose, there may be nobody in it. But it will look for the members of that group, and it will give them an Office 365 E3 license minus the 2 components. Before that was rolled out, that was PowerShell or direct. I've got customers who do direct licensing, and they'll have every combination under the sun of licenses out there. So they're like, why are those people doing that? It's because you gave them the license for it. Oh, we shouldn't have done that. Oh, someone forgot the rules. Okay? Whereas group-based licensing gives me that functionality. So it's relatively it's relatively easy to take a group. There we go. And there's 20 services today. Actually, it's gone up. It was 17 last time I looked a couple of weeks ago. So there's 20 services in Office 365 E3. Okay. I've turned 18 of them on, and within a couple of minutes, that will be assigned to those users. Okay. Let's pop back to Azure Active Directory. Okay. User settings. Manage user preview settings. Okay. Didn't talk about this one earlier, but this one's worth being aware of. Okay. Microsoft have, over the course of Azure Active Directory, have had 3 different wizards for registering for MFA. Okay? And they've had one registration wizard for self-service password reset. Okay? About 6 months ago, they released a combined MFA and self-service password reset wizard. So if you turn on MFA and you need to register, and you turn on self-service password reset and you need to register, the user had to provide their phone information twice. The combined MFA and SSPR, self-service password reset wizard, means that it'll register for both, but I only have to provide my information once. Okay? I need to turn that on. Okay? So I could do select. I'm just going to go do all. But if you were piloting this, you'd say some, selected. You'd pick a group, and then people in that group get the new wizard. People not in the group get the original wizard, which is not particularly friendly and complicated to use. Okay? If you've never done any MFA registration, so it's a greenfield site, you're a consultant, you've come into a company, you're about to move into the cloud, I would start with all straight away, because they've got no experience of the old wizard. But in offices, in companies where you've seen the old wizard and maybe you've got documentation or the help desk understand it, move to the new one via selected, so you can pilot the new functionality. Okay. For example, if I go, I need a keyboard now, if I go aka.ms/MFA setup, I'll give you a second to write that one down if you're taking notes, aka.ms/MFA setup, that will take me to the new registration wizard. Okay. And if I've never signed up for MFA before, okay, this is what I get when MFA kicks in. Okay. But it might be that I want MFA to kick in, but actually I would like to give the user a chance to register first. So I might send out some comms and go, please click this link and provide the details, here's some information. Because in 2 weeks' time, when you work from outside the office, you're going to have this set up. In 2 weeks' time, you turn on the conditional access rules. They go out of the office, and if they haven't registered, they have to register at that point. Okay. We do have, with conditional access as well, the ability to force registration only on the network as well. So I can do that. I can stop you registering if you're not on the network. Okay. But it wants a little bit more info. Okay. See how quickly it's going to load. There we go. And so next, it says, log into my phone, start the Authenticator app. And my Authenticator app takes a while to load because I've got so many customers listed on it. So most users, that loads up really, really quickly. Mine takes a considerably long time to load. Okay. And what I'll do is, because that is really taking a long time to load, what I would do is, there we go, next, list, next, add an account on the phone, work or school, scan the QR code, done, and it will activate. Not sure how much data I've got, okay, so I'll leave that and let that carry on. Okay. But at the end of that process, I'd click next, and the phone is paired to Azure Active Directory, and then when the phone's finished, because it's lacking data at the moment, when the phone's finished going through its activation wizard, I will be able to sign in and click approve on the phone, or unlock it with my fingerprint or face and then click approve. So I have to have the phone on me to log in. Okay. Let's pop back to for the last few minutes. Not that one. Where was it? There we go. Conditional access. I've got 4 preview policies. I didn't say preview of the week. It's got preview back on it again now. Microsoft are rolling out these policies. You do not need Azure Active Directory P1 for these. These are available to anybody with any license. Okay? But they're every user, no exceptions type rules. Okay? So if you need exceptions or you need to write your own rules, I'll do MFA when outside but not inside the network. I'll do MFA if you're on a company, I'll let you in if you're on a company device, but I'll block you if you are outside the UK, because you can do geo-blocks, for example. Then you need the license to do your own rules. Okay. A very nice one that exists here is the one you can just about not see because of the shape of the screen. Baseline policy, require MFA for admins. So I can go into that and I can say use policy immediately. Save. And anybody who's a member of the admin groups now requires MFA. Okay. If I take them out of the admin group, they'll stop needing MFA. But if in a few months' time I hire some more support people, help desk, a new global admin comes and joins the company, I add them to the relevant groups, they get MFA immediately. If I write my own rules for MFA for admins, I have to remember to keep them up to date. Okay. So that's a really good one. Because I haven't registered, I'm going to turn that back off again. But I could create a new policy. Okay. And what can I do with global admin? What can I do with group policy? With conditional access? Well, first of all, I can do things like who am I going to pick? Okay. All users. We don't start with all users. Start with a few selected users and pilot it. Here's the answer to our question from earlier. How do I have a different rule for guest users from internal users? Well, I would say select users and groups, and I wouldn't pick all guests and external users. So I might do something like select users and groups, and I'd pick a group that encompassed the whole of my business, my accounts, but not my guest accounts. And then my guests don't have to have MFA, but my users do. Now, whether you think that's a good idea or not, that's a discussion over lunchtime. Should my guests have MFA just like my users have MFA? Okay. But I can do guests with no MFA, or indeed I can do the opposite. Guests require MFA, users don't. Okay. But the question from earlier was, how do I let guests in without some of the requirements I have for users? So I could have, for example, users and groups, pick my group. I won't turn that on for the moment. But I would go exclude my break glass accounts that I talked about earlier. What am I going to apply it to? I can apply it again, include or exclude, all cloud apps. That may be the place that I'm aiming for. MFA on these conditions for every app. But I might start with MFA for some people, some conditions for Teams. And actually, if I do Teams, then I need to include SharePoint and Exchange as well, because Teams makes use of the services of SharePoint and Exchange. So I'd add those 3 apps. And I can test the idea. I can test that it works. I can go down Costa. Let's change my coffee company. I can go down Costa, and I can make sure it works or blocks me or whatever from off network or with a personal device at home. Okay? And then I'll come back, and I'll add more people to the group. I'll increase the pilot. And then at some point, maybe I've got 10, 20% of my organization affected by MFA, so that's this time next week. And then this time the week after, I've got MFA on for everybody. Okay? And you look at me going, that's a bit quick. And I'm like, no, that's, if you haven't done it already, that's a bit slow. Okay? Your accounts are at risk if you don't have technologies like MFA on. Rolling out MFA shouldn't be a let's think about it. Or if it is let's think about it, it's let's think about it, what do we do, how do we implement it, let's get there quickly. But there are tools, the ability exists within here and within Azure Active Directory reporting to say how well it's working. I've got my conditions. So for example, we talked earlier about the device platform. So I could say if your device platform is not, then block. That was the exclusion I talked about earlier. I go into locations. If I'm not at, and I pick my current external IP address, because it's all based on my public NATed IP address. If I'm not at such and such a NATed IP public address, so it's not my internal IP address, then, and I add that to Azure Active Directory, it's setting back a page from here, then I say if you're not on a trusted network, then MFA or block or whatever your business requirements are. Right. And then I set my controls, and this is where I actually implement it. And the way conditional access works is it looks at all the rules that are available, implements blocks first, and then if there's no blocks that apply to you, it'll apply MFA before device conditions, and there's a hierarchy, and it's written up in the docs if you want to look at it in detail. Okay? But I'll come in and I'll say what my controls are. So I might say something like, require multi-factor auth, require hybrid AD join device, as long as I've got that set up, and require one of. So it'll be MFA or hybrid. It'll actually, it'll always do MFA first anyway, so tending to do MFA and one of the others, it's going to do MFA all the time anyway. Okay. But I might do something like compliant or hybrid. Compliant would be managed by Intune, So compliant would be things like my Android and iOS devices managed by Intune, or compliant might be my Windows devices managed by Windows Threat Analytics, Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, rather, without a virus on them. Because get the virus, they stop being compliant. We talked about that one earlier. Okay. So I pick the conditions, okay, and last one I can pick some session controls. So once I've successfully signed in, the session applies. So I can do things like I can make Exchange Online read-only. So I can say Exchange Online works fully featured if you're in the office, but if you go home and you open up OA, you can have OA, but it's read-only. So you can send emails, but you can't open attachments, for example. I can do that. Or I can do the same with SharePoint. You can have SharePoint, but no download. But in a company office or a company machine, SharePoint and download, that's going to work fine. Okay. So they're the sort of session controls I get. Okay. I can also, this is new, persistent browser session. I can keep you signed in. So rather than asking the user to tick the box saying, keep me signed in, I could do something like, if you're on a company device, tick, keep me signed in, tick. I can do the keep me signed in for the user, for them. Okay. And so I can remove the sort of the barriers that come up at login. What's this question mean? What do I do? Okay. And then I enable the policy. So I haven't actually done anything there. That's fine. Once I've got my multiple policies, they're enabled with a tick, okay, I can go to what if. It's just up there on the top. And I can test it without having to actually go to Costa. Okay. But of course, you have to tell your employer that you need to go to Costa so you can expense it, so you can test it really. Okay. All right. What was my last? Did I cover one more scenario? Legacy, that's right. So there is a built-in one, yes. This is the really easy way of blocking legacy auth. You turn that on, okay? But that blocks legacy auth, okay? Because there's no other conditions. The other way to block legacy auth, if you've got the Azure ADP 1 or higher license, is you can go conditions, client apps preview, advanced, and you set the rule to not include other clients. And that's legacy auth. So you might do something like give it all users, condition, client apps, tick other clients, so you tick mobile and tick other, okay, so there's only others listed, and then you go to grant and choose block. Okay. But you would apply it to a small group of people for testing. Okay. To finish off on that, Outlook 2010 is considered other clients. It doesn't do MFA. So if you're going to turn off legacy auth, you've got to be off Outlook 2010, Office 2010 generally. Okay? You've got to be off Office 2013 if you haven't rolled out the registry keys to make it modern auth. If you're really behind on your patching and you're running Office 2013 before February 2015, then it's not going to do it modern auth either. Okay? But it's relatively easy to turn it all on. One last one to finish. See if I can see it. Let's go all users. There we go. Don't lock yourself out. When you start picking options that encompass everybody, it warns you. Because if you did something like all users and block, bye-bye demo tenant. Actually, I could do that, couldn't I? Because I need it this afternoon. If I have time this afternoon, I'll come back to this and block myself out intentionally because it's a demo tenant. Okay? And I'll show you what it looks like if you're not allowed. Okay? But that will be a phone call to support, or in my case, it'd be spin up a new demo tenant. But if it's a real live tenant, Microsoft had a lot of people phone them up. I've locked myself out. So these started appearing about 6 months ago. People were locked out for multiple days while they tried to get their support. So be careful. All right. It's time for lunch. What we got straight after lunch?
We have